So I'd like to talk about how to improve presidential elections. And I think it's pretty clear that there's a great deal of room for improvement. Exhibit A in that claim Exhibit A is the fact that Donald Trump is president. Now, we might all ask, how could this have happened? And I suspect that people will be debating that topic for many years to come. I'm going to give a very mechanical, straightforward answer. Trump became president because first, he got the Republican nomination. He won primaries in 36 states. But the striking fact about the Republican primaries in 2016 was that in none of the first 17 primaries that Trump won did he get a majority of the vote. The anti-Trump vote was bigger than the pro-Trump vote. Now that at first might seem surprising, but of course there's no contradiction, because although he got less than a majority in those 17 states, he was facing multiple opponents. He was facing Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, and about 13 other Republican candidates. And so the anti-Trump vote was split. Now, given how extreme Trump was, he might well have lost had there been just a single Republican, mainstream Republican facing him. And in fact, there's some pretty good evidence suggesting that he would have lost to either Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio. The polls in early March suggested that both those candidates were more popular than Trump in a head-to-head contest. But the fact that they both ran and a lot of other Republicans ran meant that Trump was ensured a nomination. So this can happen in the United States because we use what is called plurality rule as our primary election method. It's also sometimes called first past the post. Each voter votes for one candidate, and the winner is simply the candidate with the most votes, even if that's well short of a majority. And as I've just pointed out, plurality rule is highly vulnerable to vote splitting, by which I mean if there are two or more similar candidates, they can split the vote, and that allows a very different sort of candidate, perhaps a less popular candidate, to actually win. And that brings up my main topic, which is, can we do better? Is there a better way of electing presidents? And I would suggest that the answer is yes. And the first way of getting at that answer is to note that our current system really does not provide enough information about voters' preferences, because voters can just indicate their top choice. They can't say anything about other candidates. So as I noted, Rubio or Kasich might well have defeated Trump head-to-head, but there was no way of knowing that given our current election system, because that information was not collected from voters. So part of the solution is to allow voters to provide more information, to provide a ranking of candidates. So perhaps a voter might put Rubio first and then Kasich and then Trump, or some voters might put Trump first and then Kasich and then Rubio. So voters will be ranking candidates rather than just indicating their top choice. And then the question is, well, what do we do with these rankings? And I'd like to argue that actually a very old method, a method proposed by the Marquis de Condorcet in the 18th century, is a good way to go in determining the winner. What Condorcet argued was that voters should rank candidates, and then we should elect the candidates who, according to the rank, each of the other candidates in a head-to-head contest. So, for example, suppose that the Republican voters in the 2016 primaries broke down into three groups. 40% were Trump supporters. They put Trump first, and then Kasich, and then Rubio. 35 were Rubio supporters. 25% were Kasich supporters. Now, under our current system, you see Trump wins because he has 40% of the support, but actually Kasich is the majority winner. Kasich beats Trump by a majority because these voters, the voters in the middle, prefer Kasich to Trump, and the voters over on the right prefer Kasich to Trump, and that's 60%. And Kasich also defeats Rubio. These voters prefer Kasich to Rubio, and these voters prefer Kasich to Rubio, and that's 65%. So Kasich is the true majority winner. Now, I'm going to argue for true majority rule, but once voters have submitted rankings, there are many other systems besides true majority rule, which also become possible. And you might ask, well, why should we concentrate on majority rule? For example, we might use what is called the Borda count, which was proposed by Jean-Charles Borda at almost the same time that Condorcet was proposing majority rule. And Borda was a contemporary in 18th century France of Condorcet's. So under the Borda counts, and you've probably used this method, if there are three candidates and voters rank these three candidates, a candidate gets 3 points every time she's ranked first, and 2 points when she's ranked second, and 1 point when she's ranked third. And then we just add up the points, and whoever gets the most points is ranked first, and whoever gets the second most is ranked second, and so on. So here's an example. Suppose there are two groups of voters. 45% have the ranking Trump, Rubio, Kasich. 55% have the ranking Kasich, Trump, Rubio. Well, even though a majority prefer Kasich, notice that Trump actually gets more points than Kasich, because Kasich is ranked third by the Trump voters, and Trump is ranked second by the Kasich voters. So I'm not going to go through the calculation, but you can verify that is the Borda winner in this example. So we might ask, which method is better, the Borda count or majority rule? Now, the way that a voting theorist like me tries to answer this question is to first step back and ask, well, what principles do we want good voting rules to satisfy? Let's first look at those principles, and then let's check to see which method comes closest to satisfying those principles. Now, what are the standard principles that we ask for in a good voting method? Well, there's what's sometimes called the consensus principle. Economists call it the Pareto principle. If all voters agree that candidate A is better than candidate B, then B shouldn't be elected. It would be a very perverse system that would elect B. And not surprisingly, the consensus principle is satisfied by both majority rule and the Borda count. Another pretty obvious principle is the equal treatment principle, the idea that all voters should count equally. This is called the anonymity principle. in voting theory because it says that voters' names shouldn't matter, only their vote should matter. So all voters count equally. And again, both true majority rule and border count satisfy this. Interestingly, the Electoral College, which we use in general elections for president, violates this because which state you come from makes a difference, and that violates anonymity. Another basic principle is neutrality, which is equal treatment of candidates. All candidates should be treated equally. And again, true majority rule and the border count satisfy neutrality. So far there's no difference between true majority rule and border, but the next principle does serve to distinguish them, and that's the phenomenon that I was talking about at the beginning, which is vote splitting. The no vote splitting principle says that if an electorate is deciding between A and B, it shouldn't matter in determining which wins whether some irrelevant candidate C is running or not. Now, true majority rule clearly satisfies this no vote splitting principle, because if a majority of voters prefer A to B and also prefer A to C, if C is running, well, A is the winner in that case, but A will also be the winner if C doesn't run because a majority prefer A to B. So adding or subtracting candidates who have no chance of winning makes no difference. But that's not true of the border counts. Border voting violates no vote splitting, and here's an example. This is the example I used a few minutes ago to talk about the border counts. Notice that, as I said before, Trump wins in this scenario when 45% are Trump voters, 55% are Kasich voters, but that's only because Rubio is running. If Rubio didn't run, then it would be a two-person race between Trump and Kasich, and now Kasich would win because a majority prefer him. So the border count violates the no vote splitting principle. So we see that so far, true majority rule is better than the border counts because it satisfies all four principles that I've talked about: consensus, anonymity, and neutrality. Border count violates, and also no vote splitting. But the border count violates no vote splitting. Unfortunately, there's another principle that we want to have, which majority rule violates. And that's the principle that there should always be a clear-cut winner. In majority rule, that's not always the case. And here's an example. This is a three-candidate race where the population divides roughly equally into three groups. Notice that there is no majority winner here. Kasich is not the majority winner because there's a majority who prefer Rubio. These people prefer Rubio to Kasich, and these people prefer Rubio to Kasich, and that's 68%. But Rubio can't be the majority winner because Trump beats Rubio. These people prefer Trump to Rubio, and so do these, and that's 67%. But Trump can't be the majority winner because Kasich beats Trump. These people prefer Kasich to Trump, and these people prefer Kasich to Trump. So this is what's called a Condorcet cycle. Condorcet himself knew this could happen, and that means that the majority rule violates the decisiveness principle, the idea that there should always be a clear-cut winner. Borda satisfies decisiveness. So majority rule satisfies 4 out of our 5 principles. Borda satisfies 4 out of our 5 principles, not the same ones. We might ask, is there any rule that satisfies all 5 principles? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no, and that was established almost 70 years ago by the Arrow impossibility theorem. There is no voting method that satisfies all 5 principles. But I would argue that Arrow's theorem is too negative because it insists that an election method must work regardless of what rankings voters turn out to have. In reality, some rankings might be quite unlikely. For example, coming back to Trump, I think it's accurate to say that most Republicans either love Trump or they hate him. And they would either rank him first or last. But although that polarization may be bad for the Republican Party and may be bad for the country, it's actually very good for majority rule, because if voters are polarized in the sense that Trump is never ranked second, he's ranked first or third among 3 candidates, then we can't have the sort of paradoxical Condorcet cycle that I showed you a moment ago. And let's define a voting rule to work well for a particular class of rankings if it satisfies all 5 principles. Voters' rankings are drawn from that class. So for example, true majority rule works well when voters are limited to polarized rankings. They would never put Trump in the middle. And now we come to the main result I want to tell you about, which can be called the Domination Theorem. It's something that I developed with my co-author, Partha Dasgupta, and it says this: take some voting method that works well in the sense I just defined for a particular class of rankings. Then it must be the case that true majority rule also works well for that same class. And furthermore, there will exist some other class of rankings where majority rule works well, but the voting rule that we started with does not. And that means that there's a precise sense in which true majority rule works well more often than any other method, because if some method works well in some circumstances, true majority rule must also work well in those circumstances, and there will be other circumstances where true majority rule works well and the other method does not. Now, let me close by asking, will we ever see true majority rule used for presidential elections or other sorts of elections? And I think there's cause for optimism, because at least in this country, we don't need national laws on voting methods. Each state can decide for itself how its citizens are going to vote. And there is a method quite similar to true majority rule called ranked choice voting, which has been used in a number of cities around the country quite successfully. New York just adopted it last year. And in fact, ranked choice voting was adopted by the state of Maine for federal elections 2 years ago. And there's a good chance that Massachusetts will be adopting ranked choice voting this year. It's going to be on the ballot in Massachusetts in November. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and I'm optimistic about the future. It's time to get rid of plurality rule. Thank you.